Welcome to the Spiritual Geek Out podcast. I'm your host, Diane Hudock, where we have fun talking about the phenomenal and the fascinating. From angels to energy healing, from mystical places to mystical teachings, this is a place where we nerd out on the science of the soul. I am thrilled to have my Aussie guest on today. He is a truth hacker. He is a freedom warrior. He is the author of a phenomenal and elegantly organized and thoroughly consciousness expanding book called The Grand Illusion. It is a synthesis of science and spirituality. Brendan Murphy, straight from Australia, thank you so much for being here on the Spiritual Geek Out podcast.
Anytime. Thanks, Diane.
Yeah, it's great to have you. Let's jump in. First off, you wrote this book when you're in your late 20s. And it, like we were saying earlier before we jumped on here, it's not really something many people do where they talk about the depth of reality like you go into in extraordinary detail in your 500 and something page book. Drawing in so many different things about quantum physics, quantum theories, spirituality. So my big question to you as a jumping off point, were you always a seeker? Or was there something that happened in your life where you had this turning point and you just said, I got to look deeper?
Yeah, it was more of a turning point kind of moment for sure. So I was always a little bit sort of like, I was leaning from, my teens, I was leaning in the direction of being kind of, a bit out of the box, a bit alternative and that kind of thing. But I didn't have my kind of full blown awakening until, I was about 20, I think, roughly. And that came about through my brother who he was at school one day. They had a speaker come in and give a talk, and he was supposed to talk about business, but he kept talking about this book. And my brother thought that was noteworthy. And, he didn't normally come home from school with a book suggestion, a recommendation or anything. It was just like something about it triggered something in him to tell me, like I needed to know this. And then sure enough, I made a mental note of it, but I delayed looking into it probably for half a year until, finally the time was right and my curiosity got the better of me. And I went and checked the book out, and that was it. That was, my mind was blown. It showed me a realm of possibility that, I'd never conceived of before, and showed me my ideas about how things worked and what was real were, ludicrously naive. And I just took it from there. My curiosity was lit, and that was it.
You were the perfect student. That's what it sounds
Thank
like.
you.
Because, when people think they know it all, it's like, oh, you're just shutting yourself off from even more possibility because there's no way. It's like we can't think our way to God. So we have to just really allow ourselves to, no matter how much we know or don't know, to be the perpetual student. So that's what I hear. And that's like a great training ground to receive all the things that you learned about and you share. You talk about on your website, which I wanted to go into a bit, these 3 core freedoms, which I think are really timely right now with what's sort of the turning point of the planet right now. And you talk about health freedom, you talk about spiritual freedom, and you talk about lifestyle and impact freedom. Maybe you could go into all 3 of those for a moment. And my question on top of that is, out of all those freedoms, which do you think is being most challenged right now in terms of humanity?
Ooh, yeah, okay. That's a juicy one. So
your time.
Oh yeah, it's obvious to me that our freedom, the most basic levels is being assaulted from virtually every possible direction. So on a personal level, on a collective level, we've never, at least not anyone who was born after say 1950 has never seen the kind of sort of fascistic assault on freedom that we're witnessing over the last sort of say 18 months ish. And so that's created a really interesting situation. I think you know, a lot of people in the sort of, I don't know, truth community, or if you can call it that, have this idea that, you know, it's a spiritual war that's going on. And, you know, there's an element of truth in that as well. But for the most part, we just really have a very kind of unconscious, we're in a system that's unconscious at its sort of most fundamental levels. And it's kind of like this demiurgic force is kind of out of control, trying to maintain its unconscious, the state of the collective, which is unconscious predominantly, and maintain that so it can maintain its own control and power. And you know, that plays out and is expressed through a lot of different layers of, you know, bureaucracy and, you know, the world of banking and the world of the medical system and big pharma and all that sort of stuff. But it's all designed in a very unconscious kind of a way for the most part, not entirely, but mostly unconsciously designed to keep the boot, you know, stomped down on the face of humanity and on consciousness, and keep it contained, and to keep us humans as unself-aware as possible. So we've just seen the most intense, you know, drastic sort of escalation of that dynamic in the last year and a half that we've ever seen. So, yeah, it's really an invitation for us to re-examine our basic concepts of freedom and what it means to be free. You know, what does that look like personally? And I see that a lot in the kind of activist kind of community, which I've been kind of involved in or ensconced in for years and years now, particularly through social media, so for a decade. And there's a tendency in that community to really focus on the sort of control mechanisms and to lose sight of the personal level, I think. What, you know, in terms of your personal agency, you know, what are you creating in your own life? How does it look? How do you want your life to look? Even though, you know, we're looking out into the world and going, oh my God, there's this amazing assault on freedom and health, you know, health's under attack with the new injection and all this stuff, which is all completely true. But then we lose sight of the fact that we still have agency in our personal lives and can still be creative in our personal lives. And from there, that's the only way we can create meaningful change. And we do that by, you know, working together and collaborating and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. By the way, I should mention, you have a great podcast, and I've been listening to a lot of your episodes, and I love the one with Jason Christoff. He's the bomb, and all the questions you pontificate upon with him. And to your point, it makes me think of a quote. I might butcher it a bit, but it's like, he says, with everything that we're fed to dumb us down, right, to take away these freedoms, these core freedoms. And he says, you know, when did they ever decide, or when did we ever think that drinking poison like alcohol was a treat? I just, you know, there's so much gravity to that. It's that we don't really realize that these are poisons. Coffee is a poison. Alcohol is a poison. These injections are poisons. The makers of these poisons are felons, convicted, not opinion.
Nope.
You can go look it up. They're all convicted felons.
Yeah.
And, you know, and for people listening, look, we have choice, and we'll get into that here because you do talk about that in your book. But I want to be able to make the most wise, consciousness expanding choice that is going to bring me into the highest frequency, because high frequency people will save the planet. And when enough people are in that high frequency collectively, then this world's going to change. That's my belief. I can't prove it because we're not there yet. But to your point in your book, you talk about the Maharishi effect. It only takes 1% to affect like 16% of the population's violence level, right?
Yeah, that's right. So there's a critical threshold. There's a threshold number there somewhere, and it might be the square root of 1%, which I think was what they found in their research. And then when you combine that work, which was completely scientific and totally empirical, with stuff like the 100th monkey, which is, you know, an observable thing, which we see again. There's science around that as well, and Rupert Sheldrake's talked about it. When you look at all these different things, start pulling the puzzle pieces together, it's obvious that there can only, like, this system and the state that it's in can only last so long as more of the monkeys continue to wake up and say, hang on a minute, I'm not on board with this. So it might be 10% of the population. I've seen that number. That was a study that came out, I don't know, 10 years or so. But yeah, so it's not even a majority of people that are needed to create the or to push through the threshold and create that radical systemic change. So that's the, I guess, silver lining to it.
For sure. Yeah. Well, you talk about in your book, it was like a factoid I didn't know. And it seems like a small thing that I pick from your book, but it stood out to me, is where you talk about heresy and how heresy actually comes from the Greek word heresis, right? And it means to choose. It means to have choice. It means to be able to, have a deeper examination into things. What's wrong with that? And we have burned people for heresy, as we know. Joan of Arc, many people.
We're still doing it. We digitally burn people now. We deplatform them. We censor them. We silence them. It's really not a lot's changed. We still have the hysteria of the group. The group mind, the hive mind, the emotional irrationalism. Predominantly embodied by the left or the far left these days, that whole thing. So, yeah, I mean, when you reach the point where having a different viewpoint other than the one that's pushed by the establishment can cause you to be ostracized or ridiculed, deplatformed, and that kind of thing, it's you're in a pretty dangerous place. I mean, it's a very dangerous. The thing that the advocates of that kind of action don't realize is that in that system, they too are completely expendable. The system has no respect for them. They're just useful idiots as far as it's concerned, and it will use them and then chew them up and spit them out when it's ready to.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a quote from your book, and you're actually quoting a mother-daughter team of researchers, and I just think it's worthy of mention. This is from Alice Bryan and Linda Seebach. Successful multidimensionals, which we are, listeners, we are multidimensional. And I'm sure people that are tuning into this podcast, my listeners, are pretty well up to speed with that. But successful multidimensionals, you say, you quote, have simply eradicated the barriers between conscious and subconscious inputs and expanded their 5 to 15% conscious awareness factor by an untold amount. Human minds, conscious awareness, have been stuck or blocked into a quote unquote dislearning mindset, which has short-circuited the potential of human mind functioning. Successful multidimensionals make adjustments necessary to unlock the mindset. And once freed from that state of non-awareness, can access higher dimensions. Amen to that. Hallelujah.
It's a good passage, that one.
Yeah, that is a great passage. But to your point, I think that's really what it's all about. It's like we have to have the gumption, the wherewithal, the ability to hack our consciousness and think from that higher plane of altitude, of being elevated above the stuff, so that we can actually have that pramonic sight, that clear yogic sight, which we all have. And to your point, we'll go into the pineal gland. That's a really cool subject that people might want to just listen to and have you talk about, but how the pineal gland is a third eye. And, we have the ability to awaken and have clear sight beyond the illusion of the sort of muck that the third dimension allows us to perceive. Do you want to go into that?
Well, the third eye thing particularly?
Yeah, well, I'll kind of jump in, and I'm pulling, as I read your book, I pulled a bunch of things that really stuck out for me that I wasn't aware of. I was not aware of that the pineal gland has the highest relative blood flow than any other part of the body except the kidneys. Is that correct?
I remember that, Pat. It's been a while since I wrote that.
Yeah, I think that you wrote that in your book, and that is, to me, pretty freaking fascinating. Because where there's blood flow, there's circulation. Where there's circulation, there's life.
Yeah.
And that, and what to your point, what are we doing but shutting down our consciousness with the things that we're doing to calcify the pineal gland? Fluoride is the obvious one, but what else?
It's obvious.
Yeah.
And that was another thing, that the research by Jennifer Luke, which showed that the fluoride accumulates most heavily in the pineal gland. So you get these sort of salt crystals that block its functioning. But yeah, it is a very interesting thing when you realize that it is biologically kind of a third eye. And the pineal it has a lot of like hormonal functions and regulating our hormonal sort of cycles and that kind of stuff, sleep patterns and melatonin and whatever. But yeah, there is also on a, if you like, a high dimensional level, there's light frequencies that are not, physical photons, or what physicists would recognize as, real light. But there's those higher overtones or dimensions of light that actually do flow in to the body and into the pineal gland. So that might be a source of that, that inner vision, that third eye awareness that, we hear about so much of. And yeah, I mean, to damage the third eye and to pollute it through, acidifying foods, toxic, all this synthetic stuff, it's not real, acid producing, that's not good for any part of the body, and especially not, brain function and pineal and in your mind. So when you combine that with the actual mind control all around us, like we live in this matrix of mind control, which is the media and the education system and, all that government and whatever, it's something to really, the act of self-awareness, to become reflexively self-aware and to intentionally monitor ourselves, and to turn our vision, so to speak, back on ourselves, on our own mind, and say, what am I doing here? Is this intentional? Is this behavior intentional? Am I actually thinking this through? Does this make sense? Like, these are questions that come from the prefrontal cortex, the highest brain center that we've got. Most people, which you were sort of alluding to, are not running out of the prefrontal cortex most of the time. Like, most people live their lives 90+% in the lower parts of the brain, which are that's where you're running on autopilot, just on habit, and habits are done unconsciously, right? So we got this, it's like the game is rigged against us, but it's kind of rigged for us to kind of grow and evolve and become something a little bit smarter and a bit tougher, a bit more streetwise and self-realized. So it's like, if we take the challenge on, it serves us, but if we don't, it chews us up and spits us out.
Right. Well, it's like, how empowered do you want to be? And that's the question.
Yeah, exactly.
And some people don't care, and that's okay, but they'll get what they put into their lives, so to speak. They'll get the sort of matching frequency. That actually probably is a good segue to talk about consciousness. And you go into consciousness a lot in the Grand Illusion. How consciousness, and this is a subject very close to my heart because I do biofield tuning, and I'm constantly in people's fields all day long, all over the world, some in person here in LA. But, at this point, I'm seeing people like you in Australia and Japan and Italy, and I have to get out of the small mind. I have to get out of the thinking brain, right? And I have to step into that quantum and step into the ether, step into the fourth reality, the fourth element, right, of plasma. And it brings me to talk about consciousness. And you say this in your book, how consciousness, very simply put, is non-local. Do you want to just explain that for the listeners?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in a nutshell, it just means that it doesn't have a particular location in what we think of as space or time. Or to put it another way, it is everywhere, everywhere at once. It is basically, there's nowhere that you can be that it is not. As a ground level, fundamental substrate of existence of any form, it's always preceded by that field of consciousness, which has, again, no spatial properties, no temporal properties. It's not related to space or time as we experience them through our, physical sensory apparatus. So I don't know if that's helpful to people, but every mystic out there knows exactly what I'm talking about.
I am with you 110%. And any mystical experience I've ever had, and you can listen to it on YouTube or go to my website and you can check that out. But that's just my own personal experience. There are thousands upon thousands of stories of mystics all over the planet that have the same experience. And like you say, the numbers don't lie. But that never happens. These mystical experiences never happen by planning, by trying to create something. They're larger than us and they're larger than the physical brain. And you make a really good point in your book too. And I keep going back to your book because there's a lot that we could talk about, how the brain is more of a receiver than a generator. And I love that because that's really sort of it in a nutshell. That it's like we are in consciousness. Consciousness is within us, but like the body is in the field. It's like the energy then creates the form. And as you say in your book, it's like when subtle bodies were formed first, energy bodies were formed first before the cells and all that. And again, many of our listeners will get that. Some people won't. But let's talk about that. Consciousness, not only is it non-local, but if you're going to have a mystical experience, you kind of got to get yourself out of the way and recognize that it's all around you and you can't think your way to a mystical experience because consciousness is not rigid or static or stayed or fixed.
Yeah, that's right. And, you can't be in like a conscious sort of, say, beta brainwave state and, like you said, think your way into those other states, which are, theta and delta states. So you have to have an altered state of consciousness to experience an altered state of consciousness. You have to have a different brainwave state to actually be able to experience that kind of different reality. And you would know, Diane, from your work with the biofield, that another way that might help people to grasp the mind or the consciousness thing in a slightly more tangible way is that the auric field, as far as I'm concerned, the auric field is the mind field, to speak generally. So there are different layers of that field, as you know, but to simplify the subject for people, all those layers, like what we call the auric field, is literally the mind field. So the body is ensconced by the mind. It exists within a field of the mind. And if you switch the body off, if you switch the brain off, then which we have, I go way into that in book 2, particularly with near-death experiences and that kind of stuff. But if you switch it off, then you have no other choice but to experience reality through those other levels of the mind. And so you're not sensing reality through a physical body anymore. So you're not tuned or resonant with the body. You're not in phase with it anymore. Now you're in phase with a slightly different order of reality. And that's all we can ever really do. It's like we're either tuned to one reality or tuned to another reality or tuned to the body reality. But that's all mind. It's all just different experiences of psyche.
Right. Have you ever had a mystical experience?
Oh yeah, for sure.
And when was your first mystical experience? Do you remember?
Yeah, it wasn't long after I read that book that I was telling you blew my mind. So that mind-opening process of the book created for me actually allowed me to have mystical experiences. And the first one I had was completely spontaneous. And that, I wrote about that, I think in, I don't know, maybe chapter 5 or something. And I was just lying in bed one night and just drifting off to sleep. And then the next thing I know, I'm infinity. That's all I can tell you is I was infinite. And at the same time as being an infinite field of awareness, I still had a point of awareness within that was still me. So it was kind of an interesting, that kind of paradox. But from there, I took up meditation for a couple of years, and then I had some very much deeper kinds of mystical experiences that were more sustained and more controlled. as I got used to being in that kind of state. So yeah, it's a very interesting thing. And I haven't meditated for a long time because I'm not really drawn to it anymore. I'm not really motivated by those types of experiences, at least at this point.
So what were your more sustained mystical experiences? What did that entail?
Kind of a similar thing, but it was connected to my body. I was able to have the experience, that expanded sort of infinite experience through my physicality. And what I was able to sense through that was, I mean, I could feel galaxies inside of me, like in a kind of tangible way. And I know that sounds ludicrous, but, it's sort of like the information of these other galaxies out there flowing through you. I mean, it's very difficult to describe that kind of thing.
Yeah, it is, because it's so beyond words. And I get that. It's like anyone that's ever had an NDE, and I can attest to that with people just coming on my podcast. And it's always the same deal. It's like, I can't even explain it. And there are no words to ultimately describe it. It's like the Tao. The moment you put a name on it or you call it something, you've lost it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in your book, you also talk about how, which I think is really important, and to the mystical experience of even having a hard time to describe that we are constantly, our perception is always being edited by the mind. So it's like Krishnamurti said, it's like the moment there is an I between the observer and the observed, there's separation, there's division. And as long as there's division, you won't really get the truth. So it's like the moment you try to describe it, it's the I describing the one. That's infinity. And it's kind of like you're already in a lie. So I get that. Have you experienced your Kundalini awakening?
I guess not in like a full on, like feeling that, heat going up the spine kind of thing. I've had people who've worked with me with the sound stuff, like the Regenetics method, Soul's work, who have had that kind of thing. My partner, Amy, when I did it for her, she had the classic symptoms, like almost spiraling up around her spine, up her back. And it was like, it was like as the energy was going up, it would like hit blockages or whatever, and she would have some discomfort there, and then it would move through, and it was up either side of the spine. It was like classic Kundalini symptoms. So some people have it really tangibly. In my case, not so much.
Yeah. Or maybe it was before you even got here, and then it just was like, okay, I don't need that.
I think you
never know.
I don't know. It's such a personal thing.
It is such a personal thing. And it's kind of I've never really asked anybody that question, but it just felt sort of organic to ask you that as we were talking about mystical experiences. Because sometimes that is a touchstone point for people. It's like, well, once I experienced Kundalini, then I knew this was that. Yeah. I experienced my Kundalini. You'd think, I've been to India a bunch of times. I've had these incredible spiritual teachers or gurus or masters, whatever you want to call them. And there's something different to each person. But you'd think it's always going to be something like that. I'm in a temple, I'm doing the Kriya, and it's like I was at a yoga workshop with John Friend. He doesn't even know this story. And back when this form of yoga that he was teaching was very popular, and then it all kind of went to shit. But, there's still people doing it. But when he was the leader of the sort of organization, I thought he was a phenomenal teacher. I'm just going to put that out there. But I was in a room with about, 300 people. And I thought he was walking around with a feather, like a peacock feather. I know. And just putting it on people's spines and just kind of brushing it ever so lightly up and down people's spines. So we're doing a meditation, and I start feeling like this water rippling up and down my spine. And I'm like, oh, that's him, like rubbing a peacock feather. He wasn't walking around with a peacock feather. But for some reason, I thought, he's got a feather. And no, I opened my eyes after a couple of minutes of experiencing this, which was pretty profound. And he's over on the other side of the gymnasium and doing his thing. So
That's it. Like, that feeling of a feather being, just tickling your back, or, you might get like a tingling sensation on your skin, that kind of stuff. I mean, you're talking about like that bioelectricity being activated, and that can feel like a million different things. So, I've had those types of things, but if you wanted to like narrow it down to a really rigid kind of like, this is what Kundalini feels like, the heat going up the spine, well, maybe not that side of it, but other variations on the theme. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's probably, just like we're infinite, there's infinite possibilities on the theme. It doesn't have to necessarily perhaps happen through the sushumna, that cord in the spine. It makes me think, in your book, you talk about, many mystics know about the silver cord that originates from the pineal gland, and it connects you to the higher dimensional realities, or to the heavens, or whatever you want to call it. Well, in my teaching, we know it as the golden thread, just another name for a different thing. So you just see that things, it's like the game telephone. So just from a simple example like that, there's an infinite possibilities of spiritual awakening experiences. And it doesn't have to look like, again, Kundalini rising, going up the spine. It could be through a near-death experience. It could be just from falling in love. It could be from a myriad of different sort of things that act like a spiritual tuning fork,
Yeah. Yeah.
In your book, you talk a lot about these quantum theories, string theory, the Bell theorem, which I thought was really cool, scalar technology, and so many others that I probably can't even remember or pronounce at the time right now. But out of all these theories, out of all these quantum sort of principles, which one just fascinates you or excites you the most right now, as far as where we're going? As far as where we're going in how it can help us heal or transform humanity again, or bring us into a new world or a new earth?
That's a really interesting question. So, ignoring the fact that I'm pretty rusty,
That's okay.
I think the basic teaching down through the ages has always been the fundamental interconnectedness of everything. And that's what the quantum mechanics discussion, that's what quantum theory has basically led us back to, is that ancient truth, which is we're all in this system, interconnected with one another. We are part of the same system. There is no separation. There are no islands. There are no islands in a plasma universe, as they say. And so, we've got this kind of like energetic ecology that we're all in, which we have a sort of responsibility to collectively, like, to each other. And that has nothing to do with the kind of mentality that, makes people believe delusional things like you need to inject yourself with poison so I'll be safe. I'm talking about, the simple basic truth that in a system of energy, it's either more coherent or less coherent. And that interconnectedness we can use to choose to make it more coherent if we want to, and feed our intention in that direction. And create, that coherence creates conditions that most sane people would say are an improvement on things, whether it's, simply feeling more calm or more serene, or, like the Maharishi experiments showed a decrease in crime by just a small group of people meditating in that area. So, that to me is a fundamental place to start, which, circles back to the whole discussion on what's that critical sort of threshold in creating that irreversible change, that state change in the system. But that's it. We can do some very interesting things. We can push things in a direction that works for us, knowing full well that we are being manipulated, and there is a frequency war going on where they're trying to keep us in those low frequency states to maintain the chaos and maintain the fear. And we get to choose to, step out of that.
Yeah. What do you say to people who think they're not being manipulated? Maybe nothing, but.
Yeah, generally nothing. It's the thing with people anyone who thinks they're not being manipulated is someone, in my experience, who has also not learned how to listen. And those things generally go together. So when you have someone who thinks, the thing is, right, the mind control system that we are born into is designed to make us think that we're not being mind controlled. So you've got a few different things to contend with. You've got the fact that people are deluded that they're not being mind controlled. Then they're being intentionally dumbed down. They're not being taught how to think critically. They're not being taught how to listen. And then you want to try and tell that person, hey, you're being manipulated. It just doesn't work.
Right. And then you get to be an adult and things happen in the world like a virus or a shutdown or whatever you want to call it. But we'll shut down all the grocery stores and the businesses. But hey, we'll keep the liquor stores open and the weed stores open. And we'll just in a coffee shop. So we got to keep the Starbucks open. And then we can just blow out everybody's limbic systems so they can just be totally in their fight or flight and fear and just keep plugging them with the story that is the narrative. And I don't need to go into what the narrative is. Everybody's got a TV. Most people have a TV, unfortunately. Like baseball.
Or an internet connection, and then you've got the best news possible. You know exactly what's going on.
Right.
So you're right. I mean, that's the system it's quite ingenious what they've set up. I mean, because once people are in fear, like you're describing, you can't give them information. You can't give them a new perspective. You can't reason with someone who's in fear because they just need to be, their subconscious is screaming at them, stick with the bigger herd, stay with the pack, because if you have a different thought, you'll be the lone stag or whatever that gets pounced on by the lion. That's, what's happening in there. That's neurologically, you can't work with that. So what we have to do when we have when the situation starts to calm a bit, like it has in certain places, and I don't mean a pandemic coming. I mean the simple propaganda and the emotional chaos. When that starts to calm a bit and people come back into their bodies and start, functioning a bit more normally, then you can reason a little bit, or you can start dropping little seeds and planting seeds and sharing some information here, asking them a question that they don't have the answer to, but that it might start opening their mind in a certain direction. And then that's our opportunity to actually make some headway while things are a little bit calmer. Because when they ramp it up, you just kind of got to duck for cover and hope that the zombie masses don't take you out.
It's, truth is crazier than fiction for sure.
Yeah, it's so bizarre. We live in such an interesting reality. And I'm glad I'm aware of it because it makes life really interesting, and I'd rather be here and knowing about the whole shit show circus that's going on than not know about it and live in the fantasy.
Right. And I would argue, about it, you're conscious, you're clear, you're aware, you know what you know, so that you can be one of the light workers that can help to create this Maharishi effect, this energetic momentum that can start to spread and shift humanity.
Yeah.
Because I do think the new earth is coming. And they can say, oh, there's like the new world order, but there's also in a spiritual context, the new earth. And, you talk about in your book how the pineal gland has, I think it's like 30 to 300 crystals, microcrystals, and more crystals than I think any other part of the body. It's and it picks up these piezoelectric charges. It reacts to electromagnetic signaling. So we can feel, we can intuit, we can use our higher mind to sort of precognize our future, right? I'm losing my train of thought here. Oh, shoot, I had a really good point. Oh, it will come back to me. But we'll come back to it. But I'll throw in this to the mix, because when I was asking you the sort of leading question, which is what is the most important principle of the quantum that you think is going to really help humanity, or we need right now, or is really getting you up out of your chair and excited? And you answered beautifully. For me, when I read your book, I really sat with this quote from that has to do with non-locality, and this is from two researchers or scientists named Kuttner and Rosenblum, and I'm just going to read it for people to listen to as they're driving in their car or drinking their non-caffeinated herbal tea so that they can calm down and receive. My tone of my podcast is ever evolving, Brendan. Here we go. Quote, in principle, any two objects that have ever interacted are forever entangled. The behavior of one instantaneously influences the other. An entanglement exists even if the interaction is through each of the objects having interacted with a third object. In principle, our world has a universal connectedness. And when we talk about Bell's theorem, this was labeled the most profound discovery, quote unquote, in science by physicist Henry Stapp. I would agree with that we are all connected. So maybe this brings me back to what I was saying, is that you know what you know so that you can serve this primordial web of humanity to bring us into a more elevated connectedness.
I like that. And I think that's what we're all doing, right? All of us who are doing this kind of work, whether it's biofield tuning or, writing your book, it's all contributing to an elevated awareness, which would actually result, if, when you hit the critical mass, it will result in a very different state of living for us, or the possibility of a very different and very elevated state of living.
Yeah. What's the book you're working on right now?
I'm just finishing the second half of The Grand Illusion. So it's book 2, part 2.
And where are we going with that one?
Well, it's basically a logical continuation of where I left off with book 1. Just a very deep dive into the near-death stuff, the out-of-body stuff. That kind of, with book 1, I kind of kept one foot in the third dimension, if you like, and the other foot was out of it. Whereas in book 2, it's like both feet are out very definitely, and we're sort of exploring the other layers of reality where we inhabit, the other layers of the afterlife, what's possible, the different perspectives on reincarnation and the research around that, our alien selves, other versions of ourselves that exist on different dimensions and this kind of stuff. So the thing I really try to do is look at it in a way and write about it in a way that transcends the limitations that most writers, most authors in these subjects are kind of adhering to without necessarily even being aware that they are being limited, and to transcend those blind spots and really put things together in a bit of a different way. So I like to take a more meta approach to things in general, and then you can see, it's like, well, if you have a 40,000 foot view of something, you can see things that you can't see if you're stuck down on the ground,
For sure. Well, in your first book, you give a lot of great anecdotal evidence and reference points, and so much that it's kind of like you really do a great job for, I would imagine, for someone who has some doubt, to eradicate as much doubt as possible. And you do a brilliant job with that.
Thanks,
I'll say with, for sure. With near-death experiences, have you ever had a near-death experience yourself?
Not yet, no. I'm not overly keen.
Are you looking forward to it?
Well, from all accounts, it's the most amazing thing that ever happens to anyone. So, evidently there's nothing to actually be worried about. I've read it.
It's hard.
Sorry?
So, definitely the most beautiful thing that's ever happened, from at least what I've learned talking to people. But the common thread is too that it's the most difficult reintegration, because it's like forever they now have one foot here and one foot there, and they really have a hard time integrating here.
Yeah, that's right. It's a long process. Yeah, it's been written about quite a lot. So I do talk about that more in book two, and the parallels between those people who have the near death experience versus people who have like a shamanic initiation experience of something of that nature, and the people who have, for want of a better word, like abduction experiences, alien contact, close encounters of the fifth kind, and the aftermath of all of those types of experiences is very, very, very similar, regardless of the differences in the nature of the moment of the experience. What happens to people afterwards is, a very long period of integration. They have a very different perspective on life and the meaning of life and what awaits us, on the other side of the veil and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, it's a really interesting topic. There's a lot there.
The people that you talk about in your book that have these alien experiences, is there a particular race or breed of beings or multidimensional, higher dimensional beings that people refer to?
In that world, there are a number of beings that show up repeatedly. That get referenced repeatedly. So the interesting thing about that is I think a lot of those types of experiences are they're not well understood in general. I'll say that in general. I'm probably going to piss a lot of people off with this, but a lot of what happens in people's experiences in that realm, they tend to be more visionary types of experiences, and they're different to what a near-death experience is. It's like, and I was just having this conversation with a friend of mine, Nick, who's also a writer and very, 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 very knowledgeable, very smart dude. And he's noticed the same thing, which is the near-death experiences seem to be taking people into the, if you want to call it the collective unconscious, or if you want to call it, the spirit world, whatever terminology you want to employ. And it's sort of like a real insight into the actual nature of what's on the other side of the veil kind of thing. Whereas a lot of the visionary experiences and people having, contact with what they are experiencing as aliens and what have you, that tends to be more of it's like if NDEs give you an insight into the mind and the brain of what's really going on under the surface, the other side of the equation is giving you an insight into the dreams, the dreamscape, and the fantasies of the collective. So it's like there's a very kind of interesting dichotomy between the two, and those two worlds generally don't meet. There's quite a few contradictions there between them, and it's a huge thing to try and look at from a higher vantage point and go, how does this fit together? Does it fit together? And so I think there's often a lot of misunderstanding around the nature of those contact experiences, because I just think that they're inherently difficult to pin down, and they don't always, what seems to be happening on the surface level isn't necessarily what's actually going on, even though it might be a very powerful experience. And it's a valid experience. It's just a matter of, pulling back and interpreting things from that 40,000 foot place,
Right. I totally get that. Yeah. And if you're trying to interpret an experience that is just from another dimension, and you're trying to interpret using the laws of physics in this dimension, in this body, I can only imagine sort of like the difficulty I would imagine with that kind of download.
Yeah, that's right. And there's a great book, a channeled book called Seth Speaks, and it was channeled. Yeah, you would know about it for sure. And Jane Roberts channeled it, and the Seth intelligence or entity makes the point with this kind of stuff, talking about these kinds of experiences, where in terms of what we would call like an alien consciousness, trying with that or other dimensional consciousness, trying to then come into our reality to interact with us. They have to take on a sort of camouflage in a sense, because their natural form is not something that exists here. And then we, by the same token, we have to meet them, if you like, halfway. And so we end up in a place that is neither here nor there. And it's kind of a beyond that doesn't belong anywhere. And it doesn't fit any of our established categories. So it's a really sort of nuanced kind of a exploration and discussion to have. Trying to pin that stuff down is really messy, and I think a lot of what we see, definitely a lot of what we see in that realm, is a lot of cultural stuff, like pop culture, figures from movies, TV shows, this kind of stuff, they start showing up in these experiences, and you go, oh, I can see where that came from. It's like you've sourced that. But the collective mind, the collective unconscious, uses that kind of symbolism and these figures and images as part of its evolving kind of storyline of what's going on. But it's more of a dreamscape fantasy world than an actual, this is how it is kind of on the other side of the veil. And it's teasing that stuff apart, separating them out and going, okay, this is the real deal. This is kind of that Star Wars kind of astral Star Wars fantasy world, which has been evolving. It's been changing and developing over the decades. And you can see it in the books that these people who've had the visionary kind of experiences with these other intelligences, they keep evolving the storyline. And it's like, you can kind of, if you pull back and read enough of it, you can sort of see it unfolding, and it gets more intricate and more characters show up, and the storyline gets more, the plot line gets more and more convoluted and sophisticated. But it's still, most of what's going on is might piss people off, but most of it is actually nonsense.
I would agree with that. I had a healing with a woman some years ago, and this was before I even knew about these particular beings that have been written about by many people. But I had never experienced this. I'd never heard of it. It was never in my conscious awareness or knowledge. And I was having healing, and all of a sudden, this massive praying mantis like surgeon comes in, and he's just like, and he's just pulling out some stuff and sewing me up. And it was like I had a sensorial experience where I could feel almost like it was it wasn't painful, but it was like a tolerable sensorial feeling of like a burning, almost like a laser that didn't have pain. And I felt myself being sewed up, and this guy had to be, I don't know, 10 feet tall. And he was huge. And so of course in my mind, I'm going, okay, I'm having this experience of this praying mantis with these incredible sort of skilled hands that are fingers, whatever they were, moving at like light speed and totally loving. But if you looked at this from going with that collective unconscious, like you're talking about, which I don't even know if that's out there in the collective unconscious, as I never knew about these, right?
The mantis is, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I know people have had these experiences, but growing up, I never knew about these praying mantises. And if I looked at it just from sort of my basic self level brain stuff, I'd be terrified. But I was in this state of being completely sort of suspended in a higher awareness, and it was absolute divine love in action, doing a service to whatever he was doing to my body or my field or who knows what matrix.
Yeah. It's very, what you're describing is like classic shamanic material. And I talk about this a lot in book 2 because it's so interesting to me that people have that kind of experience, like exactly what you just described. And if you go back, millennia into the shamanic traditions around the world, like the Australian originals, when they had their initiations, they would be taken to, or they would venture into this other world, like the sky world, and they would have sometimes it would be acted out by the medicine men in the flesh, but other times they would ritually insert crystals into their bodies. They would perform this so-called surgery on them, and that might be the witch doctor, so to speak, doing it there in the flesh. But also they would venture out into the astral, whatever you want to call it, and they would have that experience out of body, and they would have crystals put in them. They'd be opened up, have their innards replaced by magical power stones like crystals, and that's exactly the kind of thing that has been going on for millennia, and it's still happening to people like you just described your own experience in the, I guess, 21st century.
Yeah. 2 years ago.
It's still going on. So there's something really, really interesting. And I don't, as far as I can tell, at least as from the material I've seen, it didn't used to be that it was done by say, praying mantis type beings. It was, another kind of being. It might have been the medicine man. It might have been the sky god figure. We talk about the man, the bearded man on the cloud that, the Christians, that inhabits the Christian psyche. But that concept itself can be traced back thousands of years to the Australian originals, for example. I mean, there's nothing really new under the sun. It's a really interesting thing to start pulling on these threads. And, like Jacques Vallée did massive research into the contact phenomenon and the UFO phenomenon. And he found that, what's going on is like the fairies, what we used to experience as fairies or nature spirits and this kind of stuff. Those experiences are still happening, but they happen in a different guise, a different form now. And so we're having contact with little gray aliens or reptilians or mantis beings and very similar types of experiences. On the surface level, some things have changed, but the transformational shamanic aspects have stuck around for sure.
Yeah. And it seems like now, I could be wrong, it seems like now more and more people are actually having contact experiences. And I don't think it's just because we have the internet. I mean, the internet's been around for a while, but it seems like more and more people are having experiences. I remember my son's 11. When he was about 3, there was a huge, I'm talking like Space Odyssey 2001, huge UFO in LA, in Los Angeles, like kind of over the city. Like I live in the valley, so it's like in the valley sort of freeway. I mean, it had to be the size of like 6 football fields or something. It was massive. And you see the lights going around. People are driving. I had him in the car seat because he couldn't sleep. So we would go on drives. And we're going on a drive. And he said, not me, I didn't even see it because I'm thinking, oh, there's a car accident because people are driving like 5 miles an hour on the freeway. And he says, Mommy, look at the spaceship. And I'm like, what? And people are literally pulling over, getting out of their car and taking pictures. And my friend calls me and he's like, do you see it? And I said, yeah, this thing, it's like you're in your own live living dream. But my 3-year-old at the time, he had that cognition to go, this is not what I've seen before. And this is otherworldly.
Yeah.
I might add to your point of your new book, you're talking about past lives. He, and you being Australian, interesting, he talked a lot about his past life growing up in Australia. And he went through a period where he was missing his parents. And I would say, well, what's your dad's name again? He'd say, get really upset. He'd say, I told you, it's Fury. I would try to look up these, his mother was Mary and his father was Fury. And he'd say it with a sort of like his best Australian accent. It was really adorable. And he talked about that lifetime in detail and how he was an alcoholic and he took himself out.
Wow.
And this is at 4 years old.
Wow.
And he talked about before that, about being in New York City and being a fireman. And we would go to the fire stations because he was, of course, every little boy's into fire trucks. And he could get under the fire truck and he would point out and name all these parts. And the fire chief would say, did you teach him that? And I said, no, I don't even know what he's talking about. I don't even know what the axle is. And he could describe parts of a fire engine that I didn't even know existed. So 2 really cool experiences to kind of throw in the mix.
You can't argue with that. There's a lot of that out there. There's definitely a very strong case for, if not a linear like reincarnational process, a parallel, incarnational process where we live all these lives simultaneously, but then it looks like to each individual life in their reference frame, it looks like it's a serial thing, one after the other. But from a higher dimensional viewpoint, it's like all happening at once. But it's either way, no matter which way you slice it, it's definitely something very, very interesting going on for sure.
Yeah. I'm thinking in some life I'm living in like on the most amazing island where I'm just kind of like body surfing, kind of gliding with my feet, and I don't need a surfboard, and I'm just kind of eating sunlight. That tastes delicious, by the way.
Tastes like strawberries.
Yeah, I'm all for that. Well, Brenda Murphy, you are a delight. Thank you for just going on this spiritual jog with me and answering all these questions and more. Can you tell us a bit about what you're up to, and other than this second book that you're writing, what you're doing in Australia, and how people can find you?
Well, they can find me through Truth Network, which we created a Facebook alternative called Truth, TROOTH. When we got censored, our page was taken down in June 2018. So, the writing was on the wall at that point. So people can find me there at Truth Network, or my podcast is truthiverse.com, spelled TRUTHIVERS. Or BrendanDMurphy.com. I'm on all the socials like, Instagram and Facebook and all the usual stuff as well. So you can look me up there. I'm not hard to find.
I will say it's Brendan, BRENDAN, right?
Yes, that's right.
E. Awesome. Well, thanks a million. And when I make my way to Australia, I'm going to look you up.
Oh yeah, we're going to hang out.
Perfect. You surf?
Sorry?
Do you surf?
I have done it once before, so we can give it a crack.
I'm up for that. Hey, once is better than none. You've been on a board.
It's enough.
It's enough. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Brendan, and I'll see you around the bend.
All right, thanks, Diana. I've enjoyed it. We'll chat soon.
Hey guys, thanks for checking out the Spiritual Geek Out podcast. If you like what you're hearing here, check out more by subscribing on your favorite platform, or go to spiritualgeekout.com.